Welcome to Double Trouble, Macdonald-Laurier Institute's foreign policy podcast series, where we explore the implications of the emerging axis of authoritarianism between Russia and China for Canada, our allies, friends, and the world. Double Trouble is generously supported by Konrad-Adenauer Foundation's Canada office. I'm your host, Balkan Devlen, a director of the transAtlantic program and senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. And I am today very pleased to be joined by Una Bērziņa-Čerenkova. Una is a political scientist and a renowned China scholar. She is the head of the Riga Stradiņš University in Latvia, the China Studies Center at that university, the head of the Asia program at the Latvian Institute of International Affairs, and a member of the European think tank network on China, one of the leading experts in Central Eastern Europe and the Baltics on China. I'm very, very pleased to be joined by her today to talk about how what sort of a role China plays in the Baltics and Central and Eastern Europe, how the perception of China evolved over time, and what Canada can learn from our Baltic friends and allies when it comes to dealing with People's Republic. Una, welcome.
Oh, hello, Balkan. It's an honor to be on the podcast.
Thank you for joining and taking the time. So let me just jump into the issue here. Could you give our audience about the perception of China, how it evolved in Central Eastern Europe and the Baltics over the last 10 years, let's say, since Xi Jinping took over be the helm of PRC, how that sort of evolved and where we are in a very sort of quick and dirty overview of China's role in the region and how the countries in the region perceive China and how that evolved over time.
That is an excellent place to start, because oftentimes we start with how China's perception of the Baltics and Central and Eastern Europe evolved and how what kind of an arc did it follow. But I really like that you start with our perception here. And let me start by saying that, of course, initially there was not much of understanding, and China was a very distant topic. By the way, my colleagues and I at the time, some 15 years ago, were fighting the fact that people did not know about China's development at all, and were imagining kind of all sorts of very barren scenarios and barren landscapes. But of course, we did.
Be careful with what you wish for in terms of getting attention. Right?
Exactly. And so here we are today, warning about knowing too much and kind of praising China's development too much. So ironic in that sense. But I do have to say that, of course, at least for the Baltics, and in a sense for the Visegrad countries as well, you only can have so many priorities. And our priority was, of course, our security and our development within the Western constellation. So joining the EU was a foreign policy priority. Joining NATO was a foreign policy and security priority for us. And only after that, only later, and by the way, China didn't really care much either way also, but only later then, as our countries gained some sort of capacity, some sort of bandwidth for seeing a wider world rather than just a transatlantic world, which, by the way, always included Canada, I have to say. But still, we were locked in this transatlantic mindset. And only then, which coincided, which perhaps predated Xi Jinping a little bit. That was already during the later Hu Jintao period. And still, the lens with which China was viewed here was an economic one. That the idea, and in the end of the day, I think if we can look for a description of how our relationship with China developed and grew and then declined in a way, it has always been a second-hand dynamic. And our interest vis-a-vis China was also driven by a second-hand dynamic. We were looking at the old Western countries getting rich off of trade with China, getting the spoils of China's opening up and reform policy. And here we are kind of left behind. We should probably do what the West is doing to achieve that same result. So this was the initial view. And back then, it wasn't about China as a rising global player. It was more like this is an economic powerhouse. Obviously, of course, our region, the Baltics, we're always very wary of the fact that China is, well, officially at least, a power that's ruled by a communist party. So we've come out of the Soviet occupation with strong adversity to any kind of imposed colonial socialism, let's say. Perhaps not the story of each and every Central and Eastern European country, right? So let me just shrink this experience to us and maybe Poland and a couple of other satellites of the Soviet Union. But obviously, this has always bothered the Baltics, but somehow there was this understanding, but if the old West, the core West, can divorce the value and the political value clause from the economic cooperation clause, then maybe that's what we should do. Well, time has shown that doesn't really work.
No, that is an excellent point to sort of get a little bit more deeper into this, because as you pointed out, the sort of that thinking that you can compartmentalize that relationship with China, just basically benefiting from it at the same time, sort of ignoring or putting aside, but the values, human rights, as well as the security threats, increasing in the bellicosity of the Chinese state, and then sort of even lecturing on others if they decide to engage with it while you're getting the benefits. Of course, gets old very, very quickly. But it reminds me of talking about all communists, generally attributed to, I think, Trotsky, where the idea that the capitalists will sell you the rope to hang them with, and that's sort of what we actually sort of in a way did with PRC by engaging it and expanding it. But that sort of that perception as what I want to sort of what's the point in time in which the scales in a way fall off from the eyes of the policymakers? Was it the COVID and the sort of the thin-skinned attitude of PRC with the wolf warrior diplomacy, lashing out to anyone who's criticizing PRC? Was it developments in the South China Sea, with Taiwan, with Philippines, increasing sort of militarization of the region, fake islands, all that kind of thing? Is it the change within the U.S., maybe going back to the Trump administration, but also continuing with the Biden? What seems to be to you that in the region that the people who had an experience with another authoritarian colonial power, recognizing that, well, China might be far away, but they are reaching out, and we should take these security concerns more seriously. What made the shift in the mindset?
I will give you 4 consecutive years: 2019, 2020, 2021, and 2022. And there's something that happened during all of these years that kind of pushed our region towards a more reluctant
Realistic,
stance.
clear-eyed.
Realistic or reluctant. Whether or not the scales have fallen off, it depends on what you believe in terms of China's foreign policy. There's a school of thought that says this has always been the case. China has not really changed. The characteristics of an authoritarian power that wants to regain its legitimate, quote unquote, place in the world has always been there. Just look at Jiang Zemin and Yeltsin's 1997 joint declaration, same language. There's a different school of thought that says, at the end of the day, still the foreign policy priorities under Xi Jinping, the way he puts them out, the way he underscores them, are different from Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin. So, for example, the Global Development Initiative, the Global Civilization Initiative, which is kind of a response to the clash of civilizations. No, China will find a way for the civilizations not to clash, but to coexist and to cooperate. These kinds of things. That is new. So it depends on where each particular listener, who are, I'm sure they're mostly our colleagues anyway, and they know this debate. So where the listener stands. So, but let me go back to the four events that happened during these 4 years. 2019, up until that point, everybody in the Baltic states, everybody who had anything to do with logistics, saw China as a magic pill. Let's get Chinese investors in. Let's boost our ports and our railroads by somehow inviting Chinese capital. To no avail. Nobody really wants to invest. And then, lo and behold, the port of Klaipėda gets a very interesting proposal, a proposal by a Chinese logistics company for a majority stake in the port. Here's the rub. Port of Klaipėda is a NATO port, and this becomes a security issue, and the Lithuanian Minister of Defense vetoes the deal. That's when the conversation, yes, we knew before that there's a trade war in the US and that there is an issue, but it was perhaps more far away than it didn't necessarily go back to us here in the Baltics or in Central and Eastern Europe as much. And it felt like something that the two elephants are playing out. It's their league, not our league. But here you go, 2019, you realize, oh, this is in fact about security. There's a security aspect, and it happens here. It happens in our house, basically, right here in Lithuania, in the south, to the south of where I am in Latvia. 2020, COVID, and you are absolutely right when you were asking that question. Initially, a huge soft power win for China in our region and in Europe in general. We all remember the stories of hospitals being built in a few days, right? Some of them were exaggerations, let's say. Some of them were kind of, indeed, some of them were reposts of true information, but yet, of course, strategic information coming out of Chinese agencies, news agencies. But then somehow that was lost, and that started getting lost with the conversation of how China is handling COVID itself and how it is detrimental to societal development, to societal freedoms, and just a decent way of human life in China proper. 2021, Lithuania, again, our southern neighbor, decides to not show up for China had this hub and spoke format in Central and Eastern Europe, in a region that it kind of crafted itself, called it 16+1. Then Greece joined for some reason, 17+1, but nothing was really happening. So the countries joined, like I said, hoping for some economic gain, but this was mostly photo ops. And of course, it had died down a little bit with COVID anyway. The countries had lowered their participation, at least our countries. And then 2021, a conservative, very anti-authoritarian foreign minister of Lithuania says, what's the point? Let's not go there anymore. Let's officially say we're not a part of that constellation anymore. And another thing that happens is Vilnius opens a Taiwanese representative office, which adds insult to injury for Beijing, and Lithuania really gets it. Economic retaliation. Suddenly, ships carrying Lithuanian produced cargo suddenly realize that there is no such country in the Chinese customs database anymore.
I mean, that is an amazing, I think, a symbolic thing in the sense that how PRC, particularly Chinese Communist Party, think of this, right? So to me, I mean, I'll get back to
Let's cancel Lithuania.
Exactly. It's like, it makes you like disappear. We just got to disappear your country code because we're upset about you. So it's a very communist way of thinking of it. Like, we all saw Stalin photos where, it's photoshopped in a way at the time and remove people who were no longer desirable from those photos from Stalin, from the Soviet Union. It's the same mentality. You displease us, you are a non-entity, right? So, and this is not even a major trading partner. This is a small, very small trading partner, very small thing. So it is, to me, a very emblematic, the way that GPC thinks of its relationship with other countries, what I tend to call, this is very clear for Russia, but increasingly clear for China, what I call the animal farm understanding of sovereignty. Right, just going back to Orwell's famous book Animal Farm. All countries are sovereign, but some are more sovereign than others, right? And that sort of understanding that they're not really seeing them as equal, despite whatever the language they might be using, but saying that how do you dare to insult the emperor? We're just gonna pretend that you don't even exist. Is a very very interesting way, insight into, I would say, to how CPC thinks about the world and the world order and the place of smaller countries in the world.
And I'm kind of inclined to think that this comes from a position of weakness or a perception of weakness, because this is not a self-assured, confident player. So in a sense, I think here this was a very strong reaction to something that China considers a red line, but we know that the goalposts are shifting, and red lines kind of they are like
Red
sands.
lines,
Yes,
yes.
red lines are more like sands at the beach rather than a strict line on a court, on a hockey court.
Yes.
We are both ice hockey nations. I couldn't avoid
Yes.
that.
No,
But-
I completely agree in the sense of the sort of the sense of vulnerability and thin-skinnedness really come through that. But I believe, and I wrote about this before, I believe that they really fundamentally believe that the West is out to get them, and nothing we can do
Yes.
actually do to convince it.
And what you just said, in fact, what you said about some countries are more sovereign than others, leads me to my fourth consecutive year, and that's 2022. And that, of course, is Russian full-scale invasion in Ukraine. And everybody in our region is, of course, mortified at that time, February 2024, early morning. We are all, and by the way, this is a very personal story for me as well. And my family and I are sitting, looking at the TV and listening to the to the air, the sounds that go off over the center of Kiev, and we cannot stop crying for them, but also for us, because you woke up to this absolutely crazy new world, and your worst fears have come true. And at that point, of course, us China watchers get a call from policymakers asking, what do you think is China going to do? Putin just came back from China, right? They just signed that agreement. What are they going to do? And China doesn't necessarily immediately react. Remember, there was kind of but when they did come out with a statement, it was a statement that they obviously didn't endorse Russia to the full extent, but did nothing to help Ukraine. And even if it didn't endorse Russia, it endorsed Russia's explanation of the underlying causes. We attacked this country because we were afraid that NATO is going to attack us soon, or we were, as China said it, as the spokesperson of the Chinese MFA said, oh, look, when big countries are pushed to a wall, this is what happens, right? So somebody pushed Russia to a wall, and then it developed into, and I'm a narrative scholar, right? So I'm often criticized, and my brothers and sisters in arms are often criticized for not looking at the world the way it is, but looking at the way countries want to tell their story. Well, it's not necessarily true. We also look at the way things are, but how countries want to be perceived is a huge part of how things are. And so,
fake it until you make it is a thing for states too, and not only individuals. So I completely get where you're coming from.
Yes. And this is also, this is our methodology, and we stand by it. And so we were watching at where this is going to lead, what this is going to develop into, because we know that, of course, China's goals go beyond supporting Russia. It is an actor that wants to be number one. It is an actor that wants to have enough stake in the international system to be able to bend it from within or without, as circumstances demand for its interests. So
I think this is a super important point. I mean, I want to sort of re-emphasize this for the audience, that if you think China's interests are solely in its immediate neighborhood and dealt with only historical sort of grievances or claims that they might have, you're sorely mistaken. This is a country that has global ambitions and would like to have influence in shaping not only its immediate region, but also how the global system works and how it is perceived and how it is being dealt with in other parts of the world, including Europe, Latin America, North America, elsewhere, right? So it is super important to point out that this is not a regional problem. Exactly. South America, North America, pretty much everywhere. That this is not a country that only is, I just have this issue with Taiwan, and that's all of it, or these small rocks in China, South China Sea, blah blah blah. it is a power that has global ambitions and act accordingly. So if you think this is a regional problem, you're sorely mistaken.
And so, as we listen to how China then voices these ambitions, we see that in a system that is being represented by, for example, the global initiatives, it is a system where sovereignty of the big guys matters more than sovereignty of the little guys. And that is a challenge, coming from the Baltics, coming from from a region of small countries that nevertheless value their sovereignty. It is a challenge, and so we were looking out to see. I mean, the Sino-Ukrainian relationship up until that point had actually been quite deep, right? Even there was even a defense and military aspect there. Purchase of vessels and there were exchanges. And my Ukrainian colleagues, sinologists, have written about this, right? That the depth of the exchanges before that, also in agriculture and everything. But here you go, and then what you expect? How will China then explain this? And China comes out with this very new, very worrisome 3 words: legitimate security concerns. And it's being put in joint statements with Russia. And what are these legitimate security concerns then? It is a situation when apparently a country, not the Americans, right? The West doesn't have that card. This card is granted to the ones that are kind of like-minded with China. So if you have a legitimate security concerns card in your hand, you can play it and attack a neighboring country because they looked at you wrong. As
Exactly.
you know,
Exactly.
so in that to me, and that to me is scary, because such legitimate security concerns can be then used to argument an attack on my country, even though we are NATO members. But it's a new world, and everybody kind of agrees with that. So, and what is scary then? One can say yes, and this is something we hear a lot. And by the way, there is some truth to that. You could say, so what even if that's the case? The US has been a very nasty hegemon during the 20th century, especially during the first decades of after World War II. It has engaged in active measures in government subversion, bribes, has been a nasty member of the international security constellation system. Why not, have somebody else give it a go? And my response, and not just my, obviously, we've heard it come from many analysts, is that the domestic system of China does not have checks and balances, does not have the opportunity to speak truth to power. And in that is then being projected to the outside. When we hear a Western power being criticized, for the most part, and we deal a lot with information manipulation and interference, so we analyze these narratives. And very often the narratives that are being amplified within authentic behavior by authoritarian states, anti-Western authoritarian states, these narratives originate from the Western states. So it's their own civil society that comes up with this criticism, that speaks truth to power, that, objects to questionable policies, to lack of rule of law, to human rights issues.
Where,
That's
where,
how we
where,
know.
where is the China equivalent of Pentagon Papers or Iran Contra scandal or similar? Where those things emerge, as you point out, because of the checks and balances, because of the democratic system, and then how those empower accountable for the abuses of that power. Where are the China equivalents of that? This does not exist. So when
Exactly,
people
because the
engage in
system.
whataboutism, they are completely ignoring, willingly, I would say, that particular aspect you rightfully highlighted.
And so the challenge here, if you have a contender for that kind of a role, somebody that says, okay, the existing rules-based international order is less than perfect, I agree. But what do you have to offer? And we don't see that this offer actually can solve the issues that it's putting forward. But I would like to make a point here quickly that we sometimes underestimate when we talk about China's rise. We sometimes underestimate one thing. China indeed has been gathering, for example, group of friends of the Global Development Initiative at the UN, standard-setting groups of friends. We see that in votes as well. But China is a master of bilateral relations. It is a player that is trying to show that or wants to be perceived as a multilateral kind of center. But we saw in our region also actually is a testament to that at the end of the day, China employs in day-to-day diplomacy only bilateral instruments. And this is where our strength then, as NATO countries, lies, is that we are a truly multilateral organization. So I would like to, to the colleagues who read, for example, the Global Defense Security Initiative, I apologize, or listen to some of these projections of China getting more and more partners globally. Don't forget that one thing is to have partners on some issues, ad hoc partners, people who will agree with you that development is good and a societal division is bad. Yes, you're going to have countries agreeing with that, but creating a truly multilateral system out of this is a challenge China cannot currently undertake.
This is an excellent point. I mean, I just want to reemphasize that when my sense and from what you say and from what I read is that when China talks about multilateral, it is multilateral in the sense that there are multiple countries engaging bilaterally with China, rather than creating a system of rules and regulations and norms where there is a give and take, a back and forth, some level of equality among the partners, developing a common understanding. It is China engaging in multiple partners bilaterally to push a particular agenda. And I think that is a super important point, because China, both as a country, its economic size, its military size, et cetera, once it manages to deal with small, medium, or even large countries on a bilateral basis, has a lot more leverage than if it has to deal with a group of countries, allies, such as NATO allies, such as Asia Pacific allies, AP4, for example. When one of the reasons why they're so upset when these negotiations or these talks happen and NATO presence, or not presence, but basically sort of more engagement in the Pacific upsets them, is the fact that it makes it very hard for them to put that particular pressure bilaterally when they're faced with a group of countries that are actually coordinating their behavior and try to engage with China as a group rather than as individual countries. So we should not really fall for the idea that by banding together we're somehow ganging up on China. It's basically a way to prevent China to coerce bilaterally, which is their way of engaging with it. We're coming towards the end. I want to ask two very quick questions. One is that we did talk about those 4 pivotal years, right, of how it changed. And of course, basically, China right now enabled the primary enabler of Russia's war in Ukraine through its purchase of its energy, through its supply of the critical things that they need to make the weapons, even if they don't necessarily send the weapons themselves, et cetera, et cetera. What is the currently sort of the understanding within the region? I'm sure there are differences within different countries, so I don't want to sort of paint a broad brush in this one. But what is the way in which different countries try to balance the clear security concerns, particularly as a result of China's support for Russia and Russia's war in Ukraine and against Ukraine, on the one hand, with the continuing drive for economic engagement? What are the different strategies to do that? And then after with this, I just want to wrap up by what can we in Canada learn from particularly the Baltic countries' engagement with China and troubles with China?
I would say that a traditional Baltic approach, and we have excellent colleagues, by the way, across Central and Eastern Europe as well, who do China analysis, and we've always discussed this. Our approach is somehow similar, at least among the EU members. Let's see what Brussels has to say about it. And I mean, on one hand, of course, it is a little weak. You you'd want to be active and proactive, perhaps. But on the other hand, indeed, with a limited foreign policy resource capacity and with a major challenger right here across the border, major challengers, if we add Belarus as a hybrid player against us on the border as well, then what you see is maybe it's not bad. And especially as Brussels has been, and the European Union and Ursula von der Leyen's geopolitical commission, I know others, they're being laughed about it, but I do see that there has been some geopolitical approach when it comes to China. And I'm actually happy about that because on one hand, yes, the EU had moved from the trifecta of partner, competitor, rival to a very clear de-risking approach. Let's see where we are over-dependent. And what I like about the de-risking approach is that it is an open approach. It is the same thing that China's been doing vis-a-vis the West.
Absolutely. Right? That's a very important point
same
to
thing.
highlight. Exactly.
Secondly, it doesn't come with a pre-recorded conclusion. It's an open policy that says, okay, let's do an audit. Let's see in which domains are we really, really dependent, and let's see what we can do. So in that sense, I am, even though I've always, I never pass on the opportunity to critique small nations not, trying to get agency when they can. But at the end of the day, I think it's not bad because we always say that among the EU 27, the commodity that we really lack is unity. So in this case, it's not a bad deal. Of course, the second thing that we are following is also at least in the Baltics and Poland, is our very strong transatlantic link. So in a sense, we're more influenced also by Washington than some of the larger EU members. So we have these two as our main kind of policy shapers. So here you go. And I don't think it's going to change. But when it comes to lessons learned, and I think it can work both ways, I think a major lesson that we are learning from each other is what to do with asymmetric and hybrid threats that emanate from autocracies. And in my field of information manipulation and interference, we see both online and classical, media behaviors that emphasize and exponentially spread the narrative of this old narrative that we like so much of China as a very good economic partner, something that our polling across the Baltic states, we had a paper out last year with the EESC in Lithuania, and it's called Classic Cleavages in New Light, and we measured how people, how are they perceptive to China's narratives across the domains of economy, values, and geopolitics. And it's the same old story. China really invests here, and by the way, Canadian colleagues say that it's the same thing over there. China really invests in the story of economic cooperation as beneficial to all, and all these value and geopolitical aspects as just things that are basically impediments. So I guess we have to learn how to push back. But another thing that we should definitely learn from Canada is the fact that Canada, as a historically overseas Chinese community country, it has had its fair share of debate what to do when it comes to covert influence. But at the end of the day, you have these debates with dignity towards the communities that form a part of Canada. And when it comes to Europe, it's not always the case. So that is something that not just my region, but Europe in general should learn from Canada.
Now, this is an extremely important point. I think we should do another podcast definitely on this information operations component. As you might be following, there is a huge, in the past year and a half, election interference and foreign interference inquiry going on here in Canada, and particularly, of course, the role of Chinese Communist Party interfering in various levels with the elections, with the nominations, the transnational repression targeting the Chinese ethnic Chinese communities, both mainland as well as Hong Kong communities here in Canada, has been a central problem for us, and I think there's a lot to talk on that, where we can also sort of learn and compare notes with regards to how China sort of engage in information operations. So we definitely need to do another podcast on that, because that's a very, very crucial point for us. But I want to end on a note which you highlighted. I think is one thing also that Canada can learn, and which you suggested when it comes to Central Eastern European countries and Baltics living into Brussels in a way. And to me, the sign there is that we also need to recognize that countries like Canada and Latvia and Lithuania and Estonia and Poland, we need to be working together to confront this particular challenge, given the resources we have, given the other challenges that we need to be dealing with. There is strength in numbers, not only vis-a-vis China, but also vis-a-vis sort of greater powers as well, in order to have our voices being heard within the alliance, within our friends. It is also important to be able to team up together and push back. So we may not necessarily take the lead on certain things, but we could definitely link up to make our case known and to work together. And I think that's a very important lesson that Canada should learn, working closer with our transatlantic allies, with our Indo-Pacific allies, in dealing with the China challenge, and not being picked one by one, as Benjamin Franklin said. If we don't hang together, we will hang separately. We don't want to do that. But we are unfortunately over time. Otherwise, our producer colleagues will be upset a little. So we are going to cut it off and here. But definitely looking forward to have more conversations on this, especially on the disinformation. And thank you so much once again, Una, for joining Double Trouble. Just to remind our audience that Double Trouble is generously supported by the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation's Canada office, and we're very grateful for their support for us to be able to make this product come out. And thank you, and until next time.